Ambitious entrepreneurs have to find the calibration between their ambition, their drive, and their focus to get things done, and the reality that good things in business, long-term relationships, structures in the scale take time. There's no shortcut to that sort of stuff because we're dealing with people, and there's just no shortcuts in ourselves.
Designed to encourage, empower, and educate real estate professionals by sharing best practices from business leaders that are proven winners. I'm your host, Kyle Malnati, and this is Calibrate Real Estate. Broadcasting from the Mile High City, thank you for tuning in to the Calibrate Real Estate Podcast. I'm your host, Kyle Malnati, and as you know, this is the podcast designed to encourage, empower, and educate real estate professionals around the world. My esteemed guest today is a good friend of mine. We've met many times. He's out in Washington, D.C. His name is Brandon Green. Brandon, say hello to our audience.
Hey, everybody. Kyle, so excited to be here today. Thank you for having me on.
Well, we are so appreciative. So for those of you who don't know Brandon, Brandon is a mega rock star in our industry. He's an entrepreneur in the real estate industry and the co-founder of Keller Williams Capital Properties, which, by the way, has almost 1,100 agents in 8 locations across Washington, D.C., Maryland, Virginia, that whole, kind of quagmire there of,
right.
of cities intersecting. But great job building an amazing organization. And I know that you were one of the 5 co-founders. You and a good friend of ours, Bo Mankiti, really expanded the business in a great way. And so let's talk about that humble beginning of, a handful of folks get together, say, we want to start a Keller Williams franchise from scratch. Obviously, you have some help from Keller Williams International. Sure. But what's that like? I mean, that entrepreneurial bug is really cool. And what was it like in the early days? And then also, how did you kind of stair step that growth curve?
Yeah, so it's a fun story. The story really begins in 2005 when Bo Mankiti and I did a deal together. So I was with Prudential, he was with Coldwell Banker at the time, and we had a transaction. We were on opposite sides of the table, and it was one of those tough transactions that the only reason it's staying together is because of your relationship with the co-op agent, because your clients have made monsters out of each other. You know that kind, right?
Yeah.
And through that process, though, we really grew to respect each other and were intrigued by each other. And after the deal was done, we decided to have a conversation about, wow, if we were to launch another kind of organization in Washington, D.C., what would it look like? What are the options out there? And could we reimagine the real estate business as it existed at that time? And so that was exciting. And ultimately that led to an exploratory phase of almost a year where we looked at a variety of different business models and opportunities, including just launching our own, and ultimately landed on Keller Williams as our business partner, and then brought along the other folks that helped us launch the enterprise in 2006.
Well, it's a phenomenal story, and I know that wasn't it. I mean, you've got years and years and years worth of growth that, I would imagine for aspiring entrepreneurs, aspiring business owners, a lot of us that are listening are independent contractors or folks that are just operating a team. And being a team lead is a wonderful thing, but scaling an organization requires a lot of systems. It requires a lot of talent, but also requires a lot of hard work and teamwork. So just all of those things that I just mentioned, how do you figure out, who does what in scaling a business of that size
right.
over more than a decade?
Right. Well, so you're like, okay, what's the real story, right? Like, how does it really come together? How did it come together? So, I think that if I take you back again to that time frame of 2006, I would break it down into a few phases. I think that early phase was a lot of excitement, right? Early optimism, anything is possible. We're rock stars and anything all the time. And that level of exuberance definitely is critical to getting the thing off the ground. And we had that. And at the time, we were brand new in the marketplace in terms of an alternative model in a Washington real estate market that was extremely traditional in how it was thinking. So that early phase was kind of all just fun, to be honest, right? We were hustling, and we like to be in the underdog. We actually launched our physical locations in areas of the city geographically that people were skeptical of. We wanted to come under the radar and prove our model, because we knew if we went like in the heart of the DC market, the competitors would eat our lunch. And so sort of launching under the radar and having that underdog feel was great. Then 2007, 2008, 2009 shows up, right? As the market starts to really tumble. And we looked around and said, you know, we think we've got a strategic advantage here. We don't have the overhead and infrastructure of a lot of our competitors, and started to see that as the market shifted in 2008, 2009, it was an opportunity for us to grow the physical platform and also begin to recruit top talent into the organization. And to your earlier question, Kyle, that's really, I think, where we started to look at what does it mean to scale a business? I mean, it's one thing to have one office or two offices, maybe three, though we realized around 2007 and 2008 that if we were going to do this and do this right in the heart of the nation's capital, we had to be competitive with the biggest and best players in this space, which meant we needed more than two or three offices, and our entire thinking started to shift. I mean, really, my business was predominantly focused in on the District of Columbia, which, if you know the district, you know it's a relatively small geography. Well, the marketplace is really more of a regional marketplace in 3 different states with 3 different licensing, right? And so we really had to start challenging ourselves about how to grow a strategy that was scalable. And I would say what we got right early on was the vision, right? We got the vision right. We said, this is where we're going, and we got the reason why we were going there right. What we struggled with, and I'd say we continue to struggle with today, is when you're growing and scaling a business, it's very easy for the organization to outgrow the hires that you make, because the organization is growing faster than the individual's personal or professional development. And so in those early days, it was a real hard struggle. It continues to be a struggle today, though. In the early days, we didn't even know necessarily the context, but we were making a hire, and 6 months later going, why is this hire not a fit anymore? Did we just totally screw it up? And it was, no, we didn't really necessarily screw it up. We just made the hire for the hire we needed today, not realizing that in 6 or 10 or 12 months, which is just around the corner, we needed an entirely different individual with an entirely different background. So I'd say that's where it started to get real fast, when we realized we were churning through people at a pace that was not comfortable, and we needed to figure out how do we get ahead of that curve a little bit.
Sure, because when you bring someone on board, whether they're in leadership or they're just in sales or production or however you bring that person on board, that person leaving is real disruptive to the existing group that's there. And especially as a smaller organization, that can really hurt. Other people can leave with them. Other people get bent out of shape because something occurred. There was some big issue that they caused or created. And so that turnover can be really toxic. And I think that you're touching on the fact that, you know, being able to scale an organization is not just systems, but it's also the leaders that are helping implement different models, different systems, and leadership is very difficult. And one of the things we've talked about in a previous interview, dating back about 2 years ago for a book that I'm working on, is just how you let others operate in their own space. Specifically, how do you allow people to make mistakes and fail? Right. And I'm going to paraphrase this, but what I had said in this interview in the past was sometimes we want to coddle our team or our leaders that are maybe direct reports under us instead of coach them. This idea of coddling instead of coaching. And your response was along the lines of helping someone work through failure is so much about setting parameters with which they can fail. And it's also important to let them know that you're not going to let them sink this ship completely, and you're not going to let them blow up the company to the point where it gets so far off track that you can't recover. So talk about just that concept of setting someone out on an objective on your behalf and knowing that they may not come back with a victory.
Right. Well, man, there's a lot in there, right? I think that what I've learned is there's usually a simultaneous growth process occurring. One is the organizations, right? The organization's got demands, needs, and opportunities. The second is the leader or the individual, the employee you have in the position. And the third is your own, right? And I'd say that the thing that has been challenging that I've often gotten wrong and sometimes gotten right is figuring out how to give someone enough room to grow without giving them so much room they cascade the company into a place that's hard to recover from. Not easy to talk about, right?
Sure.
Not easy to determine. And what I've noticed for myself in that is if I'm engaged mentally and emotionally and excited about that individual and the organization at that time, I'm able to discern where the line is much more effectively. There have been other times, though, where I have been tired, checked out, and annoyed and have made a hire in order to get something off my plate that I was tired of doing. And therefore, I was much more apt to just let them go do whatever they were going to do because it was better than me doing it. And that didn't give that individual, and I did that several times, the guidance and support. You could call it the parameters, or you could just call it the coaching, right? And so now, getting a little bit better, hopefully, at this over time, what I realized is if I'm at that point where I'm just burned out, I've actually gone really too far, and I have to be super cognizant of surrounding that leader with other people who are clicked in and have the perspective of how much room someone can have to grow without taking the organization on a tight right or tight left-hand turn, which then if they don't work out becomes a very difficult thing to get back. So at scale, this is even harder, right? If you can see everybody and they're all around you in your one office or two offices, you can sort of feel when somebody comes in that day, right? And you're like, you're a little off. Is everything okay? But if they're an hour, hour and a half away from you and you don't ever see them except for maybe once a quarter and you're interacting with them on conference, Zoom, or some other medium, you lose that little sense of things, and therefore the implications of not being in touch are bigger because you usually go much further on the edge until you discover it than you would otherwise. So there's a lot in there around that, though. I'd say your point here about how much room to give somebody to grow without either giving them too much or suffocating them, in many ways, is at the heart of what leadership is figuring out how you calibrate that properly.
Well, I think it's perfect that you answer the way that you did, because it's a humble answer. It's one that I have experienced, and I think anybody in any sense of leadership has experienced, where you hire out of desperation. There's always a need, of course, right? But when you hire from this period or this place of desperation, it's never a good thing, because you're setting yourself up and the new person up for failure.
Yeah.
And what ends up inevitably happening is you're going to stay because you're the leader, but they basically were given an unfair chance, and sometimes they overcome, but oftentimes it doesn't work out. And so recognizing those periods of being burnt out and not maybe bringing someone into a toxic version of you, I think is very important. And it obviously happens over experience, right?
It does. And I'll kind of tell you a funny one. I kind of thought that I had made enough hires that were good that I was maybe out of that mistake. No, literally a year and a half ago, I made a hire that was so off that the team thought I had some larger strategic initiative in play because it was so not a fit, and that I've been doing this for a while. The team literally thought, well, gosh, he must have something up his sleeve because this is crazy. Nope, it was just a crazy hire. And, after a week, I was like, oh man, what have I done? And I had, relocated this individual. So we had put in a lot of money into it. So, I think we get better at this, and yet we still continue to often make these mistakes. What I would say, though, has gotten better is my recognition of when I've made the mistake and my ability to move quickly to correct the mistake in a compassionate way. The old Brandon Green would have either let it sit too long, or in a very in a way of not me taking full responsibility for it, fired the individual and not have done that in a way that respected the fact that I was the one that made the hire decision. So I don't know. I hope that my ratio of hiring gets better over the years, but I'm not 100% sure it has, although my ability to make corrective action has gotten better.
Well, I think that's great though, because it is very interesting that for someone like yourself that has such a good track record, you'll have people in your own organization say, okay, this doesn't really seem like the right fit, but we're trusting of Brandon because he's always done the right thing. And he must have some grand vision in mind. And every now and again, you just whiff, you strike out.
Gone. Yeah, exactly. So that was funny for me because after it was all done, the team was like, we just were curious, like what was the plan? I was like, there was no plan. It was just a mistake. And so then we had a good feedback too around the team and saying, hey guys, don't tell me what you think I need to hear. I need you to give me the real honest sense of things. And as a leader, that becomes actually one of the big challenges, is not creating your own echo chamber within your own organization and losing touch then of the reality outside that chamber.
Oh, I love that you just said that, because I just thought it. The fact that they knew and didn't tell you. You had to figure it out on your own. And you're like, guys, come on. We've known each other for a long time. I make mistakes just like you do. Why didn't you bring this up? And everyone goes, well, we thought you had this figured out or whatever. So the idea of an echo chamber or a bunch of yes men, yes women, that's people that can speak into your life and say the hard truths or the necessary truths are huge. And that is definitely a pitfall of leadership, that you start to get people who are afraid to give you the straight answer.
Yeah. And in that case, what I realized too now in hindsight is I was actually just selling the candidate to them. And I love sales and I'm great at selling. And I realized, man, they were trying to tell me, but I was overriding their feedback through trying to sell them on why this candidate was great, rather than vetting the candidate for greatness within the company.
Interesting. Well, and one of the things that I think, just because I know your history and our audience might not know it as well, that I think is very interesting about your leadership journey, is you really have hit some of the highest peaks of what people aspire to do in the real estate industry. So you've gone from solo agent or individual producer, and you were at another company doing that. You were recognized by Realtor Magazine as one of the original classes of the 30 under 30 group, which is how you and I came to meet and have spent some time together at our reunions, one-on-one and also in a big group. Then you start a company, which I think a lot of people aspire to do. And not only did you start a company, but you grew it to a very large size, almost 1,100 agents and 8 offices. And now you're at this point, as we were prepping for the show, that you're talking about, that you're in this white space. And I'll let you describe what white space means, but that you are kind of at this point where you have delegated some of the leadership that you've been in, and you're now looking at some new things. So let's talk about the white space and the journey that you are now.
Yeah. So, I've been at this for about 18 years. And what I've realized I do is I create things for other people, actually. And I do need to sort of that entrepreneurial thing. I need to be involved in things for a period of time and then move on into the next iteration or the next business opportunity. Well, a couple of years ago, it was becoming super clear to me that the industry, our organization, and me, I turned 40, a year and a half ago, like there was this confluence of events occurring, and I was beginning to think about what's the next 10 years look like? What does the next 15 years look like in my life and also in the business? So that started to mull around in my head about 2 years ago. Well, about a year ago, it started to come to a bit of a finer point. And then about 6 to 10 months ago, I said, well, I need to do something with this. And the first thing I need to do is I need to make sure that I've secured, for whatever I want to do, right? I need to secure the leadership teams in place in the various businesses so that I have some options. And so I made a couple key hires and had some key conversations with my business partners that led to me stepping out of the day-to-day of all of my business endeavors this past June 1 really was when that happened. And it's been really interesting to sort of go into a relatively undefined white space. My thinking in that is that that the industry is undergoing rapid and enormous change. There is an enormous amount of opportunity in that. The market itself is at a peak, and sort of that combined with my personal life, being 41 now, afforded me the opportunity to say, you know what, let me just step back for a little bit and step back from the day-to-day grind and hustle of the operating of the business, which is all I've known for 18 years, and see what happens. And it has been enormously interesting and incredibly uncomfortable. I mean, literally the first couple of months, I booked my schedule out like intensely. I went on the road and just started speaking and traveling and saw my family and visited multiple countries, and it was gone for almost 2 months. I had a wonderful time, though was busier than ever. and in all of that, I had anticipated that by the fall, I would have some sort of clarity, epiphany about how it is I needed to advance and what my role would be in that. Hasn't happened. So here we are, right, in the fall of 2018, and I have realized that I need to continue to give myself more time, and that this particular phase of the journey doesn't have a time clock on it like a lot of other things that I've tried to accomplish in my life around goals and objectives. So it's a whole new space for me, honestly, man. And most days I'm having a great time with it. Other days I am antsy and anxious about the lack of definition. And people around me have been freaking out, but they're getting better. They're getting better at the answer when I say, I'm not really sure how this is going to play out. And people are like, oh, I'm sure you have a plan. I'm like, nope, I actually don't have, for the first time in 18 years, I don't have a plan. So where that's going to go, Kyle, I'm not 100% sure, though that's kind of the space I'm in right now.
Well, I think it's, first of all, I think it's wonderful that you can share it that way, that for all that you've accomplished, and for those of you that are listening or watching that don't know Brandon is highly accomplished in our real estate industry. You're not just taking, an afternoon off to sip on some lemonade. I mean, you are, I think, positioning yourself for the next run. You've run hard for 18 years. You've grown and scaled this massive organization. And I think it's important for leaders to know that it is a very necessary part of your journey to have sabbatical. And it's something that I have learned. I don't do it as well, and I'm not in that space right now because I'm growing an organization from a startup right now. But it's something I've learned from my pastor at our church. They give anyone in leadership that's been there for, I believe it's either 6 or 7 years, they give them 8 weeks off of vacation. Wow. Wow. And then I also remember our good friend Bo Malnati talking about this before he got into the real estate industry. Right. He was on the nonprofit side, and he felt like he was a big hypocrite because he gave all of his team sabbatical during periods of time, and he wasn't taking it himself. And so, of course, he goes and takes sabbatical and starts selling some real estate, and the rest is history.
That's a really good point. This happens in industries and academia all over the place. It doesn't generally happen, though, in our industry, this whole sabbatical idea. That's interesting. Yeah.
Yeah. And I think part of it is that we're all independent contractors.
Yes.
We're all on commission. And I can tell you there are 45 to 60-day periods where I'm like, man, I can't rest. I've got to ramp up my next quarter's worth of production. And so one of the things that you and I have spoken about in past interviews as I'm working on this book is the concept of margin. And you can have time margin in this sabbatical, but a lot of times that's not the right environment if you don't have the monetary margin, if you don't have savings and you don't have a rainy day fund. And so we had spoken about your start in this other interview where you talk about the concept of basically figuring out a certain sum of money that made you feel comfortable to be aggressive enough to make failure. And so I would surmise that you've probably done that same concept as you're sitting here today. You're not just doing that, maxing out credit cards and pulling out loans. I mean, you've built a system that allows you to take a step back.
Yes, that is absolutely true. So let me talk a little bit about that. So I think there's been 2 phases I've thought about that. The first one is what you're saying we talked about earlier, which was this idea that for me early in my business to take a risk, I needed a certain amount of money in the bank. At the time it was $15,000. Eventually it got up to 50, right? Was sort of the amount of money in cash I needed to have in the bank, which represented nothing, by the way. That wasn't a calculation of a certain number of months income or nothing. It was just for whatever reason, that number satisfied some deep intellectual or psychological thought pattern that allowed me to say, oh, okay, well, that's enough. I can sort of advance. So that occurred earlier on in the business and was an enormously freeing exercise to be able to identify something specific in financial cash reserves rather than having this indefinite, oh, I just need to have more money in the bank feeling, which is endless and you can never seemingly satisfy. Then there's this other iterative point that I started to wonder more purposefully about 2 years ago. Now, I am very financially driven, though I've looked at financials in a way that is, hey, if I keep doing the work I need to do year after year, and I continue to elevate my own financial acumen and understanding, I have great confidence that it's going to work out. I started to track my net worth and my passive income flow very specifically on a spreadsheet probably 4 years ago, probably 5 years ago. And that was a really important tool in helping me advance. So about 6 months ago or 10 months ago, when I started to face the reality of what it would look like if I pulled out of the day-to-day operating of my business, I had to start to face the reality of, well, what do I actually have? And if I were to stop doing what I'm doing now, what would the financial implications be? And could the family continue to live the lifestyle we're living? And I was happy to see that I had done enough to make that a very viable answer. Though I will say this about passive income. Passive income to me, and this is just my definition currently as it stands around passive income. Passive income to me is not I'm going to go to the beach for 2 years and collect checks passive income. To me, that's good, but that's probably further along the wealth building chain of having a lot of assets in, say, triple net lease with CVS Pharmacy for 20 years, paying you a nice dividend at a couple points return, right? I don't have a lot of that. I have much more active investments that are service-oriented businesses, real estate that requires somebody to be doing something around it. Though I was able to see I could collapse all of that down, all the activities associated with all that down to about 4 to 8 hours a week. And that combined with the actual passive income from some of the businesses I'm not touching much at all was enough to say, hey, I can duplicate our monthly income. And, I'm not putting as much in investments right now as I normally would like to. And we have gone through our personal expenses to tighten them up just as a cushion. Though for me, I've been looking at passive income as more like partially passive income. Stuff that doesn't require me to be present every day, but still needs me to be involved, or that could go away. So, I think sometimes people think passive income is literally hands off, never touch it again. That exists, but that's not my reality. My reality around passive income is partially passive, mostly passive, sometimes awfully active income that is down to about 8 hours a week, which gives me a lot of capacity, right, to be doing other things and thinking about other things as a result. So,
yeah, I think you're right in that definition. It's oftentimes people go from 0 to 100%. They never think of the incremental steps that you can have less and less activity while still earning an income. And
yeah.
I think the idea is that you're not forced or required to go into the office every day. You're not forced or required to be in meetings. You can kind of choose your spots and make sure that you're checking, I think, with certain leaders and checking in with certain parts of the financial reporting that okay, things are operating the way that I think they are. And you're required to be less involved on a day-to-day basis instead of zero involvement.
Exactly. And most people are actually 1 or 2 hires away from having relatively passive income in their sales enterprises. And so for a long time, I thought I was like 20 hires away from that. And they're like, no, actually I'm one in every service business I've looked at. The individual, myself included, was 1 or sometimes 2, sometimes you need 2 layers away from having it partially passive. The way I think about it in that is I want at least 2 layers between me and the consumer. 2 layers of expertise. That's it. I don't need 3 or 4, 10. I need 2, right? If I only have 1, it's all too easy for that thing to come sliding back to me, and I can't rest at night, right? If I have 2, though, the chances of both sliding back, both peeling out and the whole thing sliding back to me are dramatically lessened, particularly if I'm doing my job, which is to stay in relationship with those 2 people, right? So for the listeners out there, I'd say relook at your business in terms of a passive income and say, hey, let's say that you made 2 hires. Let's say it dropped your net income take by half. Let's say that it did. Well, if you were taking home half of what you're taking home now, but you were putting in 4 to 8 hours a week on it, tell me how that's not an interesting equation to look at. Because now you have the rest of the week, you can decide what to do with it. And depending on what phase of life you're in, I'm 41, I've got lots more to go. Then that actually becomes a far more compelling equation than keep the entire income and grind at it for 70 hours a week.
It's interesting because I'm personally experiencing some of that. I'm not at the level that you are, but in my startup that's almost 2 years old, we hired a business manager last year, over a year ago now. And then we also promoted someone into a sales manager role. And these are 2 key personnel that handle 2 different parts of my own business it doesn't allow me to completely check out by no means, but both of them working in tandem together, but then also working in relationship with me, allow me to spend less time on some of those things that, 1, I didn't enjoy doing, 2, weren't, not only were they not fulfilling and not enjoyable, but 2, I wasn't really that good at them. They were better at those things. And it makes our organization better overall because I'm happier. They're feeling fulfilled in areas that they're very good at. So I think it really is a win for everybody. And it's interesting. A year and a half, 2 years ago, when we started the business, I did not feel like I was that close to having some freedom within my own business. And I am here now. So and it will continue to develop.
Yeah. And so now that you've got a little more freedom, you get to choose what you do with that extra capacity. Now you may choose to put it back into your business, right? And continue to grow it. You could choose to put it into other businesses. But the point is, it frees up capacity for you to choose. And that's where I think the freedom of passive income comes into play, is when you put in place enough resources that you create options for yourself to make choices about where and how you spend your time. And that is a quicker exercise than most people acknowledge, actually. And I would also say that it's also a very imperfect exercise. So, part of what I was looking at was how guaranteed is this passive income I've set up, right? Like, could it go away? And what I realized in that is everything could go away, right? There's an endless number of scenarios in which all of it could go away. But man, if I spend time thinking about that, not only is that depressing, but it doesn't help me advance anything new. So I just had to sort of say, you know what? Yeah, it could go away, but I've got great confidence in my ability. Should there be an extreme scenario that causes the entire situation to change, I'll deal with it. I'll make it work. That's kind of what I've always done. And that gave me then the mental freedom to say, you know what, then I'm going to pull back and see what can be created as a result.
I have 2 follow-up questions to our topic here about maybe stepping back, taking a sabbatical. And what I think really hits on that point is that a lot of people overemphasize the impact of money in their organization. And money is like water, it's like oxygen, it is very important. It's not the purpose of your business, but it is definitely, when it's missing, you're aware of it, right? Just like you'd be aware of it if you were missing oxygen. But I think that a lot of people underestimate the importance of time and undervalue their time, but also underestimate how important it is to take free time, take time off, et cetera, et cetera. So as you're in this period, I'd love for you to just speak to that, about that necessary tension of, I've got things set up. So I feel like, and obviously you've looked at it, made sure you've budgeted for what could come of you not being as involved in these businesses, but the benefit therefore of also having some time and some thoughtful reflection.
Well, I'd say there's a couple benefits. One, for the organization and the use of my time. So when I communicated to the team, hey, I've got 4 to 8 hours a week now, the type of activities I've been engaging in are far more interesting and productive. And I would argue I'm getting more lift in that 8 hours than I was getting in the previous 80, right? Just because by taking a lot of time off the table, it created a much more effective use of the existing time that was on the table. So I'll say that about time in regards to the organization. The other part of it I'd say is, I think I underestimated the degree to which my brain was just sort of firing on execution mode and had lost some of that creative mode. And I've had to really retrain myself to get out of that grind, that push, that hustle, which is a transactionally based service business like real estate. So while that's critical in order to drive a real estate enterprise, there's consequences to it as well. And the consequence on the flip side is it constricts the other part of the brain, which is that creative side that needs an entire day, right? This like blows my mind. And it's still to this day, I'm still struggling with it. Like, you need a whole day without any appointments or calls to just sort of sit in your creative space for something new to come forth. Like, wow, who has that time, right? So, but inserting that into my schedule and saying, well, I'm going to make it work has been enormously freeing. And I mean, there's other things too clear up, right? I think I can't tell you how many people have said, oh, you look a lot younger. I'm like, okay, great. I'm going to take that as a compliment.
And you do.
Yeah, well, thank you, Kyle. It's helped the relationship, in my relationship. It's helped. I had a couple weird things going on in my body personally, but cleared that up. Like, so, sure. I think this whole idea of taking time and taking a sabbatical, be it, what I'm doing, which is much more open space, open source without a real defined end date, or one that has a defined end date of 8 weeks, is greatly beneficial in recalibrating sort of our priorities and how we're seeing the world.
Good. So
there's a lot in there, but.
No, that's good. And second follow-up question is these layers of leadership. Mm-hmm. In general, over 18 years or so, how long have you had to spend time with these people for you to feel like you really trust them to take over some major components of your business, and have you be less active and more passive in those? Is it a year? Is it 2 years? We move at the speed of trust. And so how long does that take for you to develop that trust in a leader?
Well, as I scan through the people in my head, it varies, but none of them are less than 2 years, actually, now that you mentioned that. I never thought about it that way, but I have been in relationship with one of them for the least amount of time, and that least amount of time is 2 years.
I think that's great. And the reason I say that is because I'm often thinking to myself, okay, as I'm starting with just training someone, and then as I'm giving them more and more rope, always holding on to the end of the rope, but letting them wade out a little bit further. Yeah. What's that period of time where it's like, you've had that repetition, we've had that constant coaching, that constant, let's come back and decipher what happened here. Let's do an after action review, which I've presented on this podcast before. I agree. It's got to probably take 2 annual cycles at least for you to feel like that's there. Well, that's good.
Yeah. All right, and I tried it the other way. I tried many times to hire somebody and be like, peace out, 2 weeks in. It never worked. It hasn't worked. And I'm not aware of anybody that has worked for. So I think all of us entrepreneurs that are impatient, myself included, the idea that it's going to take 2 years to get somebody up to speed is extremely annoying. And yet I've kind of just had to make peace with that and realize, hey, long game here, right? And buckle down and stop complaining and just deal with the fact that people grow at a pace that isn't like a computer download. And that takes time. It's highly nuanced. And there's a lot of things that need to occur in 2 seasons and 2 cycles.
Well, and I would think that as you've scaled this organization, you've got lots of 2-year plus warriors running through your organization that have had time with you, that then create their own leadership trees. And that's how you scale this thing to be as large as it has. So for those that are looking for maybe a little bit faster result, you've got people around you right now that are already getting that training, and they're going to be able to beget other leaders and other divisions and departments of the company too, which I think is important.
It happened just yesterday. A guy that I hired to be basically my assistant and then the administrator of an office that I was running at the time in 2011. I hired him fresh out of college. He had had one job in the restaurant service business. Just yesterday, he was promoted to the team leader of one of our offices.
It's amazing.
So super exciting for me to see that, rewarding for him. And it took from 2011 to 2018 for that development to occur. And, you know, when I hired him, I knew he had potential to do who knows what. And all along the way, he's taken on a lot of different opportunities and positions. So yeah, you seed the company at all levels with people who are possibly going to run the company. And a couple of years ago, I started actually have a standard for myself, which was I'm not hiring anybody in any role unless I think, given time and training, they have an opportunity potentially to run the entire company. If they're not of that caliber and potential, I don't want them anywhere, in any role, doing anything, because I don't have the luxury of a ton of people around here that ultimately aren't going to go anywhere. So that changed my thinking on entry-level positions and who we bring in to some of these opportunities.
That's a huge paradigm shift. I'm sure to have that realization that every person you bring in needs to be of that caliber. And what ends up happening is there's no B team at that point. You don't have, you know, your junior varsity or your scrub team. Everybody is firing on all cylinders, and that's attractive. That's very attractive for an organization to have. And I think of our good mutual friend, Bo Mankitti, in an interview I did with him years ago. Bo had reminded me that growth or success is often slow and then sudden. You know, there's this long period and then this really big jump as you hop up that learning curve. And then Bo also reminded me of the famous Bill Gates quote that people often overestimate what they can accomplish in 1 year and far underestimate what they can accomplish in 5 years. And I think that ties everything that we've been talking about together, that sometimes this just takes a while. And if you're not in Brandon's position where you've been there for 18 years, going after it, just know that you can get there and it will take time. And you just have to constantly be looking for people that can help you continue to move your organization forward.
Yeah. You know, Gary Keller, who's a mentor of mine, he said to me at one point, he said, look, it took me 10 years to go from 1 to 3 offices. So call me back when you've been at this for 30. And I thought, what? But now that I've been at it for 18, right, I get it. Like, so when somebody's been in the business for 2 years and they're impatient, I'm like, look, dude, call me back when you've been at it for 10 and then we'll talk. But so somehow ambitious entrepreneurs have to find the calibration between their ambition, their drive, and their focus to get things done, and the reality that good things in business, long-term relationships, structures in the scale take time. There's no shortcut to that sort of stuff because we're dealing with people. And there's just no shortcuts in ourselves. So yeah, that's something that I work on every day.
Well, I want to turn the interview into a couple of final questions here. We've talked a lot about the journey and a lot about some of the struggles, some of the learning opportunities. Let's talk about the most memorable points of your career or impactful experiences. And you just shared one, someone that was an admin role in 2011, now as a team lead. But what are these wins, these victories that someone like yourself has experienced? And I'd love to hear just a couple of tales from the road of Brandon Green.
Yeah. So, you know, that one I just shared with you is a really exciting win. I'm very happy to share that. I think one of the, I've got, on the flip side, I've got so many interesting examples of hiring people that just don't work out. I've got, literally, so I'll give you one that's kind of funny, right? That's a little bit funny that really sort of helped me understand that my approach to hiring didn't work. So for a long time, my approach to hiring literally was a quick scan of the resume, meet them in person, make a judgment call. Let's try it out, right? So I hired a woman to be a leader in the organization early on. This is my sales organization. And that was my hiring process. And I remember the very first day that she came in, she brought her cats. And I thought, what the, like, I was so amazed that the perspective of someone would just like bring her cats to work the first day. And then I realized I really need to change like my entire threshold to hiring. So it's sort of a silly example, but it was it was such a jaw-dropping moment for me. Like, who does that?
That's amazing.
That I was like, I've got to, like, how did I not catch that? And then I was like, well, because I didn't do anything. And I realized that, what is natural and normal and sort of obvious to me is not natural, normal, and obvious to other people. And I needed to have some sort of filter screen associated with that. That's kind of a funny example, but I've had some like disastrous examples where I've hired people that have gotten on the phone and like destroyed long-term relationships in 3 phone calls, right? And tanked extremely big deals. And I'm looping back on what the, right? And so those are a lot of the pitfalls along the way. There's been a lot more of them than there have been the Joe Martins of the world that took on the leadership role yesterday, having been in the organization since 2011. Though there's been enough of those that the organization has advanced. I think the last thing that I'll mention on that have been milestones have been around key relationships and partnerships. So my partnership with Bowman Keaty clearly was a milestone accomplishment and a critical element to my success when we began in 2006, and that relationship as it is developed over time. And I would like to, if I could go back and do it again, I would put even more emphasis on key relationships and realize that, yes, I can do a lot, but my capacity is ultimately limited to the number of hours in the day and the amount of energy I have. Though that becomes much more unlimited, the more I'm able to unlock and access key relationships in my life, because all of them that I've done well in have catapulted my life to an entirely different level.
Oh, that's incredible, because it's true. It is those key relationships that often are the biggest wins and biggest losses in our business. Oftentimes, I think that when we drive too hard at something and forget the human behind the situation that we're going through is where we make big mistakes. And those are the things that really hurt. And then obviously when we have some amazing success, if you've done that all on your own, it's very empty. And winning together is very important. And Keller Williams is all about that, about winning through others and winning with others is probably the better way to say it. So I think that's great. All right, Brandon Green, last question. It's the question that I always use to end our podcast when we have an interview. It's this concept of Dear Younger Me. It's the advice you wish you knew when you were 22. You'd mentioned you're over 40 now. And as you can impart to a leader, maybe it's a leader named Brandon Green way back when, or maybe it's a leader in your organization now. What advice would you give that would impact someone's growth in such a way that would maybe fast track them through some of the struggles that you had?
So the way I'll take it in this direction. So if I could go back to my 22-year-old self, I would say to myself, there is a big difference between making money and building wealth, and you should study the difference. So I spent the first several years of my career making a lot of money and spending just as much, and sometimes more. And it wasn't until later that I learned more about what wealth building meant. And so my trajectory going up in that direction started later. So that would be something that I would go back to my 22-year-old self about and say, hey, look at what it means to build wealth and start to apply the principles to that. You've got a great ability to sell and make money through your sales enterprise. Now, what are you going to do with it? And how does that give you optionality earlier on? And
for the young person that's stuck or doesn't even know how to start learning about wealth, how did you start to become in tune with it? Or what were some of the things that happened where you're like, I'm making all this money and obviously I've got nothing to show for it. But then what were some of the steps you took to really learn about wealth? Were there people that came into your life or resources you had?
Well, my initial step was I read Think and Grow Rich, right?
Napoleon Hill.
A foundational book I think a lot of us started with. And that caused me to start to ask some questions like, what is that? And then I started to listen to folks that I perceived as having great wealth, started to read other books by people that have built great financial success. And then later started to get into conversations with actual people who are doing a great job of that. So it's been an iterative process, I think, that for me, the first step was I needed to get my documentation right. So I realized shortly after reading that book, I had no documentation on profit and loss statements, balance sheets, budgets, net worth statements, great accounting and bookkeeping resources. Probably took me 3 or 4 years just to get that going and getting a handle on what I was actually doing, and then be able to set some goals around what I'd like to do going forward.
Well, I think that's a great point, is that you have no excuse in our information technology world right now. There's so many resources out there, and yet you brought up a book that's got to be 70 years old.
I know, right?
And that's the interesting thing, is nothing is new in this world.
I
We have new ways of doing it, but that Napoleon Hill book was written, I think, in the 60s. And
I think it was in the 20s. I think it was
20s.
in the 20s.
Okay, so gosh, I was way off. I'll have to go back and look at that. But the point is, there's great resources out there that you don't have to, I mean, obviously podcasts are one thing, but finding out someone that has had a full life, and you can say from the start to the finish, has done well, I think is very important, as opposed to maybe interacting with someone who's in the middle of their journey and you don't really know what the end is yet. So I think that that's great. There's plenty of resources out there about building wealth. That's a great book, because I've heard several people cite it, and several real successful people cite it. So your next step, as we close our interview, is that you're passionate about this topic of leaders that are leading during times of great change or great uncertainty. And that's something that you're toying with, the idea of creating a podcast, and that's something that's a topic that's passionate. What are you learning as you're preparing for that? Because I know when I do a podcast and produce it, I'm learning with my audience. So as you're thinking about that, what are some of the things you're learning about leaders that are leading during times of great change?
Yeah, so I'm going to do the podcast, and what I've realized in this little white space I'm in is one of the critical things for all of us in business and in life to do to remain relevant as we move forward in this global digital economy is we've got to be masters of our own media and be amazing content creators, and we got to figure out these distribution mechanisms. So I'm definitely in that space deep right now. But to your point, specifically about leaders leading in a time of great change, I think there's a couple characteristics that are starting to come through as I'm speaking to more of these people and researching them. One is authenticity. Right? Leaders who are leading through a time of great change have great authenticity and are really empathetic and real. And in some cases, don't even see themselves as leaders per se. But because of who they are and what they represent and how they go about life, they are. And that is a real tight alignment in truth and honesty around who they actually are. Right? The sort of new age media and digital environment that we're in has created a level of transparency and vulnerability that is quite interesting. It's exposed us for who we actually are. It hasn't, I don't think it's changed us. I think it's just exposed like what we've always been. And leaders who are effective in that, there's just no daylight between what they say and what they do. They just do what they're going to do. And I think the other one is reliability, right? And not necessarily reliability in the traditional way we might think of business leaders, like delivering a certain profitable result. And although that's all still very important, it's reliability in their commitments and being willing to do exactly what they say they're going to do and make new commitments when they're unable to fulfill the commitments that they've made. And just being real tight with that. And often it's in the little stuff, like, great leaders are able to respond to things when they say they're going to respond to them. They show up on time and they fulfill people's commitments. As a result, they're more reliable, and reliability builds trust, and trust builds the ability to build a community and start to advance as a result. So I'm looking at stuff like that, and I'm excited about diving into more interviews and more research, and then creating some additional content around that.
Well, Brandon, thank you. You have been so generous with me over the past 5 years that we've gotten to know each other. It's been a really fun journey, and gosh, I feel like it's 5 years. It's probably closer to 4, but it's been amazing just what our relationship was, and to be able to share some of that openly to a broader audience, I think is really cool. And I definitely have appreciated this interview. I very much appreciate you and all the generosity that you've had as you involve me in your organization. So thank you for that. And as I close out our podcast, I'd like to thank you, Brandon, and thank our audience. Please do subscribe to our podcast. on Apple iTunes and YouTube. And obviously, if you love our podcast, please rate it. We would love a 5-star rating. So for Brandon Green, I'm your host, Kyle Malnati, and we will see you around the neighborhood. Bye, everybody.
Bye.